pull up a chair and let the fire warm you. Today, when we think of fine dining, we picture Michelin stars, pristine white linens, and the delicate arrangement of ingredients. But in the Dark Ages, the definition of a luxury meal was something far more terrifying. To the kings of old, dinner wasn't about the subtle balance of a sauce or the quality of a sear. It was about the theater of the grotesque. It was a raw display of dominance over the natural world, favoring the shock of the spectacle over the pleasure of the palate. Consider the Cockentrice, a nightmare of a dish where the upper torso of a young pig was sewn onto the lower half of a large chicken and roasted into a singular, stitched-together beast. Or consider the pungent aroma of roasted whale vomit, a rare delicacy prized more for its haunting oceanic musk than its actual flavor. Perhaps the most jarring of all were the animated pies, where a golden crust was sliced open only to have a swarm of live, frantic frogs leap out onto the laps of the startled nobility. I'm just a guy reading stories from the dusty archives, and if you'd like to explore these strange shadows with me, I'd invite you to subscribe and stay a while. Before we begin, I'm curious, where in the world are you listening from tonight? Now, close your eyes and let the modern world go quiet. The candles are flickering, the mead is pouring, and the feast is about to begin. As the scent of roasted meat drifts through the hall, you might assume this feast is a simple display of indulgence. But for the medieval mind, a dinner plate was never just a collection of ingredients. It was a precise map of the universe. To understand why a king would choose a swan over a side of beef, or why he would shun a carrot as if it were poison, we have to look at the invisible architecture that held their world together. They called it the Great Chain of Being. This wasn't a suggestion. It was a cosmic law that dictated that everything in existence had a fixed place in a vertical hierarchy. At the very top sat the divine, and directly beneath the angels stood the king. Because the monarch occupied a space closer to the heavens than any commoner, his physical body required a different kind of fuel. The medieval logic was elegant in its simplicity. You are what you eat, quite literally. If a king was a creature of the heights, his food had to come from the heights as well. A heron, a crane, or a magnificent peacock wasn't just a status symbol because of its price. These creatures lived their lives suspended between the earth and the heavens. By consuming them, the king was reinforcing his own proximity to the stars. The higher the animal flew, the more noble its flesh was considered to be. A pheasant that spent its days in the brush was acceptable, but a hawk or a lark was a spiritual multivitamin for the ruling class. Now shift your gaze from the rafters down to the floor. Think of the plants that grow downward, pushing their roots into the cold, dark muck. In the medieval hierarchy, the earth was the lowest of the four elements, heavy, dull, and corrupt. Therefore, anything that grew inside the soil was viewed with suspicion, if not outright disgust. To the courtly elite, a turnip or an onion was the food of the wretched. These vegetables were heavy with the essence of the dirt. It was believed that if a nobleman gorged himself on root vegetables, he would physically and temperamentally begin to resemble the peasants who harvested them. He would become slow, coarse, and tethered to the mud. A king who ate like a farmer would eventually lose the refined spirit required to rule.
This created a massive dietary divide. The poor ate from the ground to stay grounded in their labor, while the rich ate from the sky to remain celestial. But there was a second, even more complex layer to this culinary theater: the Galenic theory of humors. In the drafty corridors of the Dark Ages, medicine was a matter of balance. Every human body was thought to be a vessel filled with 4 primary fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. These humors determined your temperament, your health, and your very soul. A king's greatest duty wasn't just to lead an army, it was to keep these internal tides from crashing into one another. If his blood became too hot, he would spiral into a murderous rage. If his phlegm became too cold and moist, he would sink into a lethargic, weak-willed stupor, unable to defend his borders. Every dish served at the royal table was a pharmaceutical intervention. The master cook worked in tandem with the court physician to ensure the king's temperament remained perfectly sanguine, the ideal balance of heat and moisture. This is why medieval recipes are often baffling to the modern palate.
They weren't just seasoning for flavor. They were balancing the complexion of the meat. Beef was considered naturally cold and dry, which was dangerous for a king. To fix this, the cook would boil it to add moisture, and then roast it to add heat, finally smothering it in hot spices like pepper and ginger to ensure it wouldn't cause a buildup of black bile. Sugar and spices were the most powerful tools in this chemical arsenal. Because they were hot and dry, they were used to cook the food inside the stomach, which was viewed as a literal furnace. If the internal fire wasn't hot enough, the food would rot in the belly, sending toxic vapors to the brain. This is the real reason the king's meat was buried under mounds of cinnamon, cloves, and mace. It wasn't to hide the taste of spoiled flesh. That is a modern myth. It was to ensure the king's digestion was rapid and his humors remained light. Every bite was a calculated move in a high-stakes game of biological chess. To eat was to maintain the state. To feast was to keep the universe in its proper order. As the servants bring out the next course, remember, the man at the head of the table isn't just satisfying his hunger. He is holding his very identity together, one wing of a roasted swan at a time. Cross the threshold of the great hall, and the first thing that strikes you isn't the grandeur, but the heat. It is a concentrated wall of humid air, thick with the scent of charcoal, rendered tallow, and the heavy, sweet musk of hundreds of unwashed bodies pressed together. This isn't the refined, quiet elegance we associate with modern fine dining. It is a sensory assault. The smoke from the central hearth rises to the rafters, swirling around the blackened beams before finding a slow escape through the louvers in the roof. Down below, the light is flickering and orange, cast by torches dipped in resin that hiss and spit hot wax onto the straw-covered floors. You are walking into a space where the very air tastes of salt and wood smoke. There are no delicate silver forks resting on lace cloths here. In fact, the fork is a suspicious foreign novelty that won't see common use for centuries. Instead, the tools of the trade are basic and brutal. Every man carries his own knife at his belt, a multi-purpose blade used for skinning a deer, fending off an assassin, or hacking a hunk of meat from a communal spit. For everything else, there are fingers.
Spoons exist, carved from horn or wood, but they are reserved for the thick pottages and stews. For the most part, eating is a physical, tactile engagement with the food. You feel the grease on your chin and the heat of the juices running down your wrists. Look down at the place settings and you won't find porcelain. You will see trenchers. These are large, flat rounds of coarse, 4-day-old bread. They are stale, hard as a board, and serve a singular purpose, to act as an edible plate. As the evening progresses, these slabs of bread soak up the gravy, the blood from undercooked venison, and the leaking fats of roasted boar. By the end of the night, the trenchers are a soggy, flavor-packed mash. If you are a high-ranking noble, you might eat your trencher, but more often than not, these grease-soaked remnants are gathered in baskets and tossed to the hounds, or distributed to the beggars huddling at the gates. It is the ultimate display of waste as wealth. The king's table produces more saturated bread in one night than a peasant family might see in a week. The geography of the room tells you exactly who matters and who is invisible. This isn't just a dinner, it's a map of the social order. At the far end of the hall, on a raised wooden platform called the dais, sits the king. He is elevated, looking down upon his subjects. He sits in a chair with a high back and perhaps a cushion, a rare luxury in a world of hard stools and benches. Everyone else is arranged according to their proximity to his shadow. The high-ranking earls and bishops sit closest to the center, while the minor knights and clerks are pushed further down the long, narrow trestle tables toward the draughty doors. There is a literal line in the sand here, often marked by the great salt cellar. To sit above the salt is to be someone. To sit below it is to be an extra in the king's play. If you are at the far end of the table, the food reaches you cold, the best cuts having already been plucked away by the hands of your superiors. You are there to witness the king's abundance, not necessarily to share in its finest details.
But consider the sheer scale of what is happening behind the scenes. To feed a court of 300, 500, or even 1,000 people requires a logistical operation that mirrors a military campaign. The king's arrival at a manor isn't a social visit. It is a locust-like event that can strip a countryside bare. In the days leading up to this feast, the silence of the surrounding woods was shattered by the sounds of the hunt and the slaughter. Imagine the tally. To provide just one evening's entertainment, the royal butchers might process 20 oxen, 50 sheep, dozens of pigs, and hundreds of head of poultry, from common chickens to the more prestigious herons and gulls. This isn't just about nutrition. It is a calculated exhibition of ecological dominance. By consuming the forest and the field at this volume, the king is demonstrating that he owns the land and everything that breathes upon it. The mountain of bones left behind at dawn is a political statement. He isn't just the ruler of the people, he is the apex predator of the landscape, and every carcass brought into this hall is a trophy of his absolute authority. In the Dark Ages, power is measured in the weight of the meat you can afford to let rot. But as the shadow of the cathedral falls across the royal table, the definition of meat begins to blur. The authority of the king might be absolute in the forest, but even a monarch must navigate the complex demands of the soul. In the Dark Ages, the calendar is a battlefield between the hunger of the belly and the requirements of the church.
For nearly half the year, the consumption of four-legged animals is strictly forbidden. These are the fish days, Lent, Advent, and every Friday and Saturday, when the red blood of the hunt must be scrubbed from the plates to make way for the cold silver harvest of the water. Yet for a king accustomed to the richness of the feast, a simple bowl of grains is an insult to his status. The royal solution was not to abstain, but to redefine nature itself. To the medieval mind, biology was a matter of theology rather than science. If it lived in the water, if it swam, or if its habits were dictated by the tides, it could, with a bit of creative logic, be classified as a fish. This was the great loophole of the Dark Ages, a way to keep the royal belly full of flesh while remaining technically within the bounds of holy law. The first victim of this linguistic gymnastics was the beaver. To any observer, the beaver is a mammal, a furry architect of the rivers, but to a king's chaplain looking to satisfy a hungry master on a Friday, the beaver possessed a singular saving grace, its tail. Scaly, flat, and perpetually wet, the tail was declared to be of a fishy nature. While the rest of the animal might be off limits, the tail was hacked off, roasted, and served as a legal delicacy. It was a greasy, fatty prize that tasted of the riverbank, yet satisfied the craving for animal protein when the law demanded abstinence. The air in the royal kitchens during these holy seasons does not smell of simple grilled trout. It carries the heavier, more pungent scent of the sea's true monsters. If the beaver was a small concession, the barnacle goose was a masterstroke of culinary deception. In an age before migratory patterns were understood, the sudden appearance of these geese on the coastline was a mystery. A myth took root that these geese did not hatch from eggs, but rather grew from driftwood or emerged from the shells of barnacles clinging to the rocks. Because they were born of the sea, they were not birds of the air, but fruit of the ocean. This allowed the king to dine on roast poultry in the middle of Lent, a loophole that turned a period of penance into a theater of cleverness. The gose was stuffed with herbs, basted in its own fat, and presented as a miracle of the waves, a bird that had never touched the earth and therefore carried no sin of the flesh. But the true height of this aquatic masquerade was reserved for the giants of the deep. When a whale or a porpoise washed ashore or was driven into the shallows by a fleet of boats, it was not seen as a tragedy of nature, but as a royal windfall. These were the beasts of the sea, the leviathans that mirrored the power of the king on land. The whale was the ultimate prize, a mountain of meat that could feed an entire court for weeks. However, its preparation was a grueling process of transformation. The meat of a whale is dark, dense, and oily, far closer to beef than to any white fish. To make it palatable for the royal table, it was often boiled repeatedly to leach out the thick, rancid oil that could overwhelm the senses. Once rendered down, the whale meat was chopped and simmered in great copper cauldrons with dried peas. This thick, grayish pottage was the staple of the elite during the long fasts, a heavy, filling stew that provided the caloric density needed to survive a northern winter. It was sea beef, a way to cheat the fast while feeling the weight of a heavy meal in the gut. Beyond the bulk of the whale, there was the refinement of the porpoise. If the whale was the food of the masses, the porpoise was the delicacy of the inner sanctum. It was often referred to as the sea pig, and the royal cooks treated it with the same reverence they gave to a suckling pig. The most prestigious dish in the royal repertoire was porpoise frumenty. Frumenty was a thick porridge made of cracked wheat, usually boiled in milk and egg yolks. But on fish days, animal milk was as forbidden as the meat itself. The kings, however, had a luxury that the common man could never afford: the almond. Imported at immense cost from the Mediterranean, almonds were ground into a fine paste and mixed with water to create almond milk. This white, creamy liquid became the ultimate status symbol of the fast. The porpoise meat was sliced thin, seasoned with the rarest spices the king's treasury could buy: pepper, cinnamon, and ginger, and then folded into the rich almond milk frumenty. The resulting dish was a vibrant, creamy yellow, flecked with the dark meat of the sea beast. It was a sensory contradiction, a meal that looked and felt like a rich dairy custard, but was technically, legally, and spiritually a dish of fish and grain. To eat porpoise frumenty was to display a profound level of control over the world. It showed that the king could not only command the beasts of the ocean to his table, but that he could also command the very laws of God to bend to his appetite. As the sun sets over the coastal strongholds, the royal table remains a place of abundance, regardless of the holy day. The king does not suffer the hunger of the peasant. He does not know the thin soups and the dry bread of the ascetic. Instead, he dines on the monsters of the abyss, transformed by the alchemy of the kitchen into something divine. Every bite of salted whale and every spoonful of almond milk porpoise is a reminder that in the Dark Ages, the menu is a reflection of power. To be a king is to eat what others cannot, to find meat where the world sees only water, and to turn a season of sacrifice into a feast of beasts. The sea does not just provide food, it provides the ultimate challenge to the king's dominance, and every carcass dragged from the surf is another trophy in the long history of the royal appetite.
But as the salt spray fades and the tide retreats, the royal gaze shifts upward, leaving the brine of the ocean behind for the thin, cold air of the heavens. If the sea offers monsters of the deep to prove a king's strength, the sky provides the jewels of his crown to prove his sophistication. For a monarch of the Dark Ages, power is not just measured by the weight of a sword, but by the ability to command the very elements. To feast on the birds of the air is to claim dominion over the heights where ordinary men cannot reach. Yet among all the winged creatures that might grace a high table, from the common heron to the noble swan, one stands as the absolute pinnacle of vanity and theatricality. The peacock is not merely a bird in the eyes of the royal court. It is a living painting, a creature of such improbable beauty that its presence on a dinner platter feels almost like an act of defiance against nature itself. It is the ultimate trophy of the sky, brought down from its high perch to serve the ego of the man sitting at the head of the hall. But preparing such a creature requires a skill set that blurs the line between a cook and a surgeon, between a chef and a set designer. The goal is not simply to cook the bird, but to resurrect it in a form more glorious than it ever was in life. The process begins in the heat of the lower kitchens, far from the eyes of the guests. Here, the bird is handled with a delicacy usually reserved for holy relics. The cook must carefully strip the skin from the carcass, ensuring that every iridescent feather remains firmly attached to the hide. It is a slow, meticulous labor, peeling the shimmering blues and greens away from the muscle without tearing the thin, parchment-like skin. This outer shell is set aside, kept cool and damp to preserve its luster, while the naked body of the bird is sent to the fire.
As the meat roasts, the air fills with a scent that is surprisingly unappealing compared to the bird's outward splendor. The meat is lean, stringy, and lacks the fatty richness of a goose or a duck. But in the grand economy of the king's table, the flavor is a secondary concern. The peacock is a bird of state, and its primary function is to be seen. Once the roasting is complete and the meat has cooled enough to handle, the true artistry begins. The bird is sewn back into its original skin. With a needle and fine thread, the cook pulls the feathered hide over the cooked flesh, smoothing the plumage until the creature looks as though it might take flight from the carving board. To ensure the display is truly fit for a king, the bird is given a final gleaming upgrade. Thin sheets of gold leaf are hammered out and pressed onto the beak and the claws, turning the bird's natural weapons into symbols of mineral wealth. The crest on its head, that delicate crown of feathers, is stiffened with wire to stand tall and proud. The tail, a heavy fan of eyes that seem to watch the room, is spread out in a magnificent arc, supported by a hidden wooden frame. The peacock is no longer a meal. It is an idol, a gilded monument to the king's ability to capture and refine the wild world.
Yet, for the most ambitious of rulers, a golden bird is not enough. To truly capture the imagination of a hall filled with drunken nobles and weary knights, the bird must perform. This is where the kitchen's mastery of alchemy comes into play. A small bundle of wool is soaked in spirits or camphor and tucked deep into the bird's throat. Just before the peacock is carried into the great hall, the wool is ignited. As the servants march through the heavy oak doors, the peacock appears to breathe a steady, flickering flame from its golden beak. It is a terrifying, beautiful sight. A dead bird reborn as a fire-breathing dragon of the air, shimmering in the torchlight as it moves toward the king's place. The entrance of the peacock brings a sudden sharp silence to the room. This is the theater of the Dark Ages at its most potent. The guests see not just a bird, but a transformation. They see the king's power to take the most beautiful thing in the sky, kill it, and then command it to breathe fire for his amusement. It is a calculated display of excess, a message to every rival in the room that the resources of this kingdom are so vast that even the laws of life and death can be bent for the sake of a single dinner course. But eventually, the fire burns out. The gold-leafed beak is pried open, and the illusion must finally face the reality of the knife. When the peacock is carved and distributed to the highest-ranking guests, the grand spectacle meets a disappointing end. Beneath the shimmering feathers and the golden accents lies a meat that is notoriously difficult to swallow. It is dry, remarkably tough, and often described as having the texture of old leather. Even the most skilled roasting cannot hide the fact that the peacock was never meant for the plate. It is a bird of sinew and bone, lacking the succulence that makes a feast truly satisfying to the palate. The guests chew slowly, perhaps struggling with the stringy fibers, but they do so with an expression of reverence. They are not eating for nourishment, they are consuming the king's status. Every difficult bite is a reminder of the cost of such a display. To eat something so beautiful and yet so poorly suited for food is the ultimate luxury. It proves that the king can afford to waste the lives of the most magnificent creatures on earth for nothing more than a few minutes of visual awe. The peacock is the perfect metaphor for the royal table of this era.
a dazzling, fire-breathing exterior that hides a core of hard, cold reality. It is a feast for the eyes and a challenge for the teeth, a final soaring testament to the idea that in the King's Hall, the way a thing looks is always more important than how it tastes.
But this devotion to the visual is merely the prelude to something far more ambitious. Once the primary hunger of the court is sated, the meal stops being a dinner and starts being a production. As the heavy wooden tables are cleared of the remains of roasted venison and charred boar, a silence often falls over the hall. This is the moment for the entremet. In the modern world, we might think of this as a side dish or a small bite between courses, but in the high halls of the early medieval elite, the entremet was an act of architectural and psychological warfare. It was food that refused to be eaten, or rather, food that existed solely to be watched. Imagine, if you will, the flickering torchlight catching the glint of gold leaf on a structure that has no business being on a dinner table. In the center of the hall, servants wheel in a massive fortress, 3 feet high, constructed entirely of pastry and stiffened lard. Its battlements are crenulated with precision, its towers flying silk pennants, and its gates guarded by tiny soldiers sculpted from marzipan or pressed cheese. These were not mere decorations, they were the culinary equivalent of a cathedral. They were built to be destroyed, but first they were built to be admired. Sometimes these pastry castles were rigged with internal mechanics. From the mouths of sculpted stone lions, thin streams of spiced wine would flow into silver basins, providing a constant, rhythmic splashing that cut through the low murmur of the intoxicated guests. This was a wine fountain, a staple of the grandest feasts, where the beverage was secondary to the sheer wasteful miracle of its delivery. To see wine flowing like common water from the mouth of a golden beast was to understand that the man hosting you held the very laws of nature in his hands. The transition from the solid world of meat to the ethereal world of the entremet marked the peak of the evening's boredom-killing strategy. For the nobility, who lived lives of repetitive luxury punctuated by the violence of war, the greatest enemy was often the sheer monotony of the everyday. To surprise a king was the highest achievement a chef could hope for. This desire for the unexpected gave birth to one of the most enduring and bizarre culinary legends, one we still sing about today without truly understanding the logistical nightmare it represented. When the rhyme speaks of 24 blackbirds baked in a pie, it isn't a whimsical flight of fancy, it is a literal description of a common courtly prank. The process required a master's touch and a cruel disregard for the comfort of the avian participants. A massive crust, known as a coffin, was baked first. This crust was thick, tough, and essentially inedible, designed to act as a ceramic vessel rather than a pastry. Once the crust was cooled and a hidden trapdoor or a loose lid was fashioned, the chef would gather live birds, often small songbirds or blackbirds, and carefully tuck them inside the hollow space. At the precise moment the pie was carried into the hall and placed before the high table, the head carver would plunge his knife into the lid. The result was a calculated explosion of chaos. As the air rushed into the dark, cramped space of the crust, the birds would surge upward, desperate for the light. They would burst from the pie in a frantic cloud of soot and feathers, fluttering wildly over the heads of the startled guests, extinguishing candles and knocking over goblets in their panic. For the nobles, this was the height of hilarity. To see a duchess scream as a blackbird brushed her cheek, or to watch a bishop scramble to protect his wine from a falling feather, was the ultimate entertainment. It was a spectacle of the living emerging from the dead, a jarring reminder that in the king's presence even the food could come back to life. But the logistics of such a feat were grueling. The chef had to ensure the birds didn't suffocate in the time it took to transport the pie from the kitchen to the hall. He had to keep them calm enough that they wouldn't batter themselves to death against the interior walls, yet agitated enough that they would fly the moment the crust was breached. It was a delicate balance of cruelty and timing. And the birds were just the beginning. Records suggest that larger pies were sometimes filled with rabbits or even small dogs, which would leap onto the table and scatter the silver cutlery, much to the delight of the drunken spectators. The entremet served a deeper purpose than just a laugh. It was a demonstration of total mastery over the environment. To command the beasts of the field and the birds of the air to play their part in a dinner service was to claim a godlike status. It showed that the king's wealth was so vast that he could afford to spend hours of a craftsman's time on something that would vanish in a few seconds of frantic wings and broken crust. These were the marvels of the medieval table. Moments where the boundary between a meal and a miracle became intentionally blurred. As the wine continued to flow from the pastry fountains and the smell of singed feathers hung in the air, the guests were left with a singular, lingering impression. In this hall, the impossible was merely another course on the menu. The reality of the struggle for survival outside these walls was momentarily erased by a flurry of black wings and the shimmer of a sugar-coated fortress. This was the theater of the mouth, where the act of eating was the least important thing happening in the room. But when the sugar walls fell and the black wings settled, the spectacle did not end. It merely shifted from the whimsical to the grotesque. In the flickering torchlight of the great hall, the theater of the mouth required a new act, one that moved beyond the sweetness of the fortress and into the transgressive world of the flesh. If the sugar-coated castle was a dream of architecture, the next course was a nightmare of anatomy. This was the moment the king's cooks moved from being bakers and butchers to becoming surgeons of the impossible. They were tasked with a singular, unsettling goal: to conjure beasts that God had seen fit not to create. Foremost among these culinary hauntings was the Cockentrice. To look upon it was to witness a violation of the natural order, a golden-brown chimera that seemed to have crawled out of a fever dream and onto a silver platter. It was a creature of two worlds, possessing the sturdy, bristled forequarters of a suckling pig and the feathered avian tail end of a large capon. In some variations, the positions were reversed, with the proud, beak-heavy head of a rooster grafted onto the haunches of a pig. It was a creature stitched together with linen thread and ambition, a physical manifestation of the king's power to rewrite the laws of biology. The creation of a cockentrice was a grueling, visceral process that began long before the guests took their seats.
In the sweltering heat of the castle kitchens, amidst the roar of the spitfires and the thick scent of rendered fat, the master cook acted as a macabre tailor. 2 animals were slaughtered and prepared with clinical precision. The pig was severed at the waist, its entrails removed and its cavity cleaned. The capon underwent a similar transformation. Then, using a large needle and heavy twine, the kitchen staff would suture the front of the pig to the back of the bird. The stitches had to be tight, hidden beneath layers of basting and glaze, to ensure that the illusion held when the beast was carried through the hall. The labor didn't end with the sewing. The beast had to be stuffed, often with a rich mixture of breadcrumbs, eggs, saffron, and expensive spices like mace and cloves, which acted as a sort of aromatic mortar, holding the 2 halves together from the inside. As it roasted on the spit, the fat from the pig would drip down and baste the lean meat of the bird, a mingling of juices that defied the distinct boundaries of the forest and the farmyard. To finish the illusion, the skin was often gilded with gold leaf or painted with a wash of egg yolks and saffron, giving the hybrid creature a golden monster, a testament to the idea that in the king's presence the impossible was merely a matter of preparation. This wasn't just a meal, it was an exercise in Frankensteinian hubris. We often think of the Dark Ages as a time of rigid superstition, where the natural world was a source of constant terror. But for a medieval monarch, the dinner table was the one place where that terror could be domesticated and reshaped. By ordering the creation of a Cockentrice, the king was not merely feeding his court, he was performing an act of supreme dominion. He was signaling to every noble and envoy in the room that his authority extended beyond the borders of his lands and into the very sinew and bone of the earth.
If God created the animals, the king had the right to unmake and remold them to suit his whims. The psychological impact of these Frankenstein foods cannot be overstated. In a world where the hierarchy was believed to be divinely ordained, the act of restructuring an animal's anatomy was a subtle, potent form of blasphemy sanctioned by the crown. It suggested that the king was a second creator, a man who could take the disparate parts of the world and bind them into a new, singular vision. The guests who looked upon the Cockentrice were meant to feel a sense of profound unease, a shudder of wonder in the medieval sense of the word, a mixture of awe and genuine fright. They were eating a lie, a biological contradiction that tasted of salt and smoke, but looked like a warning. The Cockentrice was only the beginning of this culinary taxidermy. The king's menu frequently featured the helmeted cock, a roasted rooster dressed in miniature armor, mounted atop a pig as if it were a knight riding to war. There were accounts of lèche lombard, where meats were ground into a paste and then molded back into the shapes of mythical creatures, or even the boar's head with fire, where the severed head of a wild hog was rigged to breathe actual flames using camphor and spirits. Each dish was a bridge between the living and the dead, the real and the imagined. This obsession with the hybrid and the monstrous reflected a deeper cultural anxiety. In the medieval mind, the boundaries between things were sacred. To cross them was to invite chaos. And yet the king sat at the center of that chaos, the only force capable of taming it. By eating the Cockentrice, the king and his court were symbolically consuming the chaos of the world. They were taking the monstrous and making it sustenance. It was a ritual of consumption that reinforced the stability of the throne.
Every bite of that stitched-together flesh was a reminder that the king's will was the thread that held the social fabric together, just as the linen twine held the pig to the poultry. The kitchen, then, was a laboratory of the surreal. It was a place where the mundane reality of survival was transformed into a high-stakes display of artifice. The cooks were not just feeding bodies, they were feeding the ego of the state. They spent hours hunched over carcasses, not just to make them edible, but to make them symbolic. They understood that a king who could command a pig to become a bird was a king who could command a peasant to become a soldier, or a wasteland to become a city. The gore of the process was hidden by the grandeur of the presentation, but the message remained written in the sutures. As the servants carried the heavy silver chargers through the hall, the cockentrice would appear to dance in the flickering light, its golden skin reflecting the wealth of the treasury, and its strange shape reflecting the complexity of the royal mind. It was a moment of peak artifice, a point where the act of dining became a philosophical statement. The world outside might be unpredictable, the seasons might fail, and the borders might shift, but here, inside the stone walls, the king was the master of all forms. He could stitch the world together however he saw fit, and his subjects would have no choice but to swallow it whole.
It was an environment where the grotesque was refined into the royal, and where the visceral reality of death was masked by the cleverness of the human hand. The cockentrice was the centerpiece of a world that refused to accept the limitations of nature, a world where the king's appetite was the only law that mattered. And as the knives carved into the gilded seams of the beast, the guests were reminded that in this room, even the monsters were subject to the king's command. The feast was a victory parade, and the casualties were the very laws of life itself. But where the laws of life were suspended for the king's entertainment, the laws of mortality remained stubbornly, terrifyingly intact for the king himself. This victory parade of cooked monsters was a double-edged sword. Every succulent bite of a roasted boar or a gilded peacock carried with it the potential for a silent, agonizing end. In an age where a political rival was more likely to reach for a vial of extract than a broadsword, the dinner table became the most dangerous room in the palace. Power brought appetite, but it also brought a paralyzing fear of the very fuel required to sustain it. This was the era of the poisoned plate, a time when the simple act of swallowing was an exercise in high-stakes gambling. To mitigate this constant threat, the royal household evolved into a complex machine of surveillance and ritual. At the center of this machinery stood a figure of tragic necessity, the assayer. Known in various courts as the pregustator or the officer of the credence, this individual was the king's human shield. His job was not merely to serve, but to die in the king's place if the kitchen had been compromised. The ritual of the assay was a meticulously choreographed performance, a sacred liturgy of survival that preceded every meal. Before a single morsel touched the royal lips, the assayer would take a portion of every dish. He would drink from the same flagon, eat from the same loaf, and then the most agonizing part of the theater would begin, the wait. The court would fall into a heavy, expectant silence. All eyes would be fixed on the assayer's face, watching for the slightest tremor, the narrowing of the pupils, or the sudden slick of cold sweat on his brow.
Only after a sufficient interval had passed, proving that the food was free from the swift-acting toxins of the day, would the king finally deign to eat. This process turned every meal into a slow-motion drama of life and death. The king's hunger was always secondary to his safety, and the assayer's life was the currency spent to buy a few hours of security. It was a role that demanded a peculiar kind of bravery, or perhaps a desperate lack of alternatives. These men were often high-ranking servants whose proximity to the king was defined by their willingness to be the first to fall. However, human biology was considered an imperfect alarm system. The Dark Ages were a period where the boundaries between science and superstition were blurred, and the elite turned to the natural world for more reliable protection. This led to the inclusion of extraordinary objects on the dining table, items believed to possess an innate sensitivity to corruption. Chief among these was the legendary unicorn horn. To the medieval mind, the unicorn was a creature of absolute purity, a beast that could neutralize any venom with a single touch of its brow. In reality, these horns were the spiraled tusks of narwhals, brought south by traders who guarded their secret source with fierce jealousy. A single narwhal tusk was worth more than its weight in gold, sometimes even more than a castle or a province. It was the ultimate defensive luxury. These tusks were often carved into elaborate salt cellars or simply placed prominently on the table, where they served as silent sentinels. The belief was that the horn would react physically to the presence of poison.
If a tainted dish were brought near, the ivory was said to sweat, breaking out in beads of moisture as it struggled to draw the toxin out of the air. Some accounts even claimed the horn would change color, darkening like a bruised fruit as a warning to the sovereign. The king would watch the ivory as intently as he watched his taster, looking for that miraculous perspiration that might save his life. Complementing the unicorn horn were the snake tongues. These were not the organic parts of a reptile, but fossilized shark teeth found embedded in the earth. To the observer of the 10th century, these sharp triangular stones looked like the petrified tongues of dragons or giant serpents. They were believed to be powerful detectors of venom. These fossils were often mounted on elaborate gold and silver stands known as langueurs, or credence trees. These structures sat in the center of the table, their branches heavy with tongues that would be dipped into the wine or touched to the meat. Like the unicorn horn, the snake tongues were thought to change hue or begin to weep when they encountered something lethal. The very name of the table, the credence, comes from the Latin word for belief or trust. It was here that the food was verified, a station of truth in a house built on deception. The use of these items transformed the dinner table into a laboratory of the occult. The salt, the most essential seasoning of the age, was kept in a nef, a large ship-shaped vessel, often made of precious metals and adorned with these protective stones. Salt was not just a preservative for food, it was seen as a preservative for the king himself. By keeping the salt in contact with unicorn ivory or serpent tongues, the court believed they were purifying the very essence of the meal. This was the physics of fear translated into the aesthetics of the feast. Every object the king touched was designed to be a filter, a barrier between his mouth and the unseen hand of an assassin. The paranoia extended even to the service itself. No servant was allowed to turn their back on the king's cup. The trial of the cup involved a complex series of handoffs and bows, ensuring that the vessel was always within the line of sight of the king or his most trusted guards. If a cupbearer stumbled, or if a shadow fell across the wine for too long, the drink would be discarded, and the servant might find himself in the dungeons. The atmosphere was one of suffocating vigilance. While the guests might be marveling at the roasted swans and the pies filled with live birds, the king was navigating a psychological minefield. He was a man who could command armies, yet he was afraid of his own soup. The tragedy of this royal paranoia was that it was often justified. The history of the era is littered with tales of rulers who succumbed to sudden maladies shortly after a banquet. Hemlock could be disguised by the bitterness of certain herbs. Arsenic was tasteless and could be slowly administered over weeks to mimic a lingering fever. The magical items, for all their beauty and the fortune spent on them, were ultimately useless against the chemistry of the natural world. A narwhal tusk cannot detect belladonna, and a fossilized tooth has no reaction to the extract of a monkshood root. These objects were symbols of power, but they were also monuments to human helplessness. Yet the ritual provided something perhaps more valuable than actual safety: the illusion of control. In a world of shifting allegiances, these ceremonies allowed the king to feel that he had mastered even the invisible threats. The assayer, the sweating horn, and the weeping stones were the anchors that held the royal ego in place, while the rest of the court drifted through a fog of suspicion. As the meal progressed and the king remained upright, the tension would slowly ebb, replaced by a dark, triumphant satisfaction. He had survived another day, another dish, and another potential betrayal. He had eaten the monsters, and for tonight, the monsters inside the wine and the meat had been held at bay by the strength of his rituals and the sacrifice of his servants. The feast was a victory, not over the beast on the platter, but over the death that waited in the shadows of the bowl. Yet, as the era of primitive survival began to give way to a more performative style of power, a new kind of light began to flicker on the royal table. It did not come from the hearth or the torch, but from a granular, crystalline substance that was being whispered about in the ports of Venice and the markets of the Levant. This was the dawn of the sugar obsession. In the early centuries of this era, sugar was not a basic grocery or a childhood treat. It was an exotic curiosity, a rare spice that carried the same weight and cost as gold, ambergris, or frankincense. It was handled with the reverence one might show a holy relic, stored in iron-bound chests and dispensed by the gram by the king's most trusted clerks. For the monarchs of the time, this white dust represented the ultimate victory over nature. It was a way to distill the heat of the sun from distant, unreachable lands into a portable, edible form. The medieval mind did not see sugar as a cause for concern, but as a panacea. It was classified by the leading physicians of the day as a medicine of the highest order. Because it was rare, expensive, and pleasing to the tongue, it was assumed to be inherently virtuous. It was prescribed to balance the four humors of the body, particularly to soothe the lungs and provide a burst of vitality to a flagging spirit. When a king fell ill, his apothecaries would not reach for the honey of the local woods. That was the food of the peasant. Instead, they would create syrups and lozenges from this imported luxury. They believed that something so pure and so white must surely be a reflection of divine grace. To consume sugar was to ingest the very essence of refinement,
a physical manifestation of the king's ability to command the trade routes of the world and the secrets of the East. As the supply of sugar slowly increased through the labor of the Crusades and the expansion of the Mediterranean trade, it moved from the apothecary's jar to the center of the banquet hall. Here it took on its most spectacular form, the subtlety. These were not merely desserts, they were high-stakes political theater. Master confectioners would spend weeks boiling sugar down into a thick, malleable paste, which they would then sculpt into intricate, brittle dioramas. These sugar sculptures were designed to be placed on the table between courses, acting as a visual warner or a herald of what was to come. Imagine a royal feast where the guests are suddenly confronted by a miniature sugar castle, complete with sugar knights on sugar horses, their lances raised in a permanent, translucent charge. Other times, these sculptures depicted entire religious scenes, the martyrdom of a saint, or the triumph of a winged angel over a scaled dragon. There were even subtleties that mimicked the very beasts being served on the plates, such as a life-size boar's head rendered in shimmering white paste. To see such a thing was to witness the impossible. It was a display of wealth so profound that it bordered on the sacrilegious. The message was clear. The king's resources were so vast that he could afford to turn the world's most expensive medicine into a temporary plaything, a piece of art that would be admired for an hour and then shattered and consumed by the high-ranking guests. But this crystalline glory came with a hidden, corrosive price.
As the obsession with sugar grew, so did the physical decay of the people who ate it. The royal palate became addicted to the substance, and it began to permeate every course of the meal. Sugar was sprinkled over meat, stirred into wine, and baked into heavy pastries. Because there was no concept of dental hygiene, the sugar would sit against the teeth of the nobility for days on end, fueling a slow, agonizing rot. The very substance that was meant to signify divine health was systematically destroying the mouths of the ruling class. By the time of later monarchs, most notably Queen Elizabeth I, the physical toll of the sugar obsession was impossible to hide. Her teeth were described by foreign ambassadors as being as black as coal, a jagged and crumbling ruin within her mouth. In any other context, this would be a mark of filth or disease, but in the inverted logic of the court, these rotting black teeth became the ultimate status symbol. If your teeth were black, it meant you were rich. It was visual proof that you could afford the most expensive diet on the planet. It meant you had spent your life gorging on the delicacies that the common man could never hope to touch. This led to one of the most bizarre social trends of the age. The peasants and the working poor, whose diets consisted mainly of coarse bread, vegetables, and very little refined sweetener, often had teeth that were remarkably white and healthy. However, looking healthy was a social death sentence. It branded them as poor, as people who lived far away from the king's sugary influence. In a desperate attempt to mimic the elites and elevate their own social standing, the common people began to intentionally blacken their teeth. They would take soot from the chimney or ground up charcoal and rub it into their gums and over their white enamel before heading to a market or a local festival. They were painting the image of decay onto their own bodies, hoping that in the dim light of a tavern they might be mistaken for someone who had feasted at the high table. They were chasing a beauty standard born from literal rot, proving that in the hierarchy of the Dark Ages, a king's sickness was always more desirable than a peasant's health.
The sweetness of the feast had left a permanent dark stain on the culture, turning the mouth into a graveyard of wealth.
This graveyard of wealth was not merely a poetic abstraction, it was a biological reality that manifested in the very marrow of the ruling class. When the mouth becomes a portal for endless, unfiltered indulgence, the body eventually rebels against the weight of its own privilege. Nowhere is this rebellion more famously documented than in the winter of 1135 and the wooded hunting grounds of Normandy. King Henry I, the youngest son of the Conqueror, a man who had survived decades of political intrigue and fratricidal war, found himself defeated not by an assassin's blade or a battlefield spear, but by a plate of jawless, blood-sucking parasites. Henry's personal physicians had been explicit in their warnings. The king was aging, his humors were out of balance, and he should strictly avoid the heavy, cold, and indigestible flesh of the lamprey. But to a king who had spent his life bending the world to his will, a doctor's advice was often viewed as a challenge to his absolute sovereignty. The lamprey was a creature of prehistoric design, a terrifying tube of muscle and circular teeth that clung to larger fish to drain their life force. In the medieval mind, eating such a monster was a way of absorbing its primeval strength and demonstrating one's status at the top of the food chain. It was a delicacy that signaled absolute control over the most repulsive corners of the natural world. Henry ate his fill, and as the chroniclers tell us, he succumbed to what the chroniclers called a surfeit, a word that elegantly masks the violent, wretched biological failure that followed. To die of a surfeit is to die of too muchness. In Henry's case, it was likely a combination of acute food poisoning, perhaps listeria or salmonella lurking in the poorly prepared eels, and a digestive system already worn thin by a lifetime of excessive luxury. But his death stands as a gateway to understanding the broader physical price paid by the medieval elite. Their tables were heavy with the spoils of the hunt, venison, boar, swan, and crane, but these prestige foods carried a hidden chemical burden that their doctors could name but never truly cure. We now know that a diet centered almost exclusively on organ meats, game, and heavy fats leads to a buildup of uric acid in the bloodstream. When the kidneys can no longer process this waste, it crystallizes into needle-like shards in the joints, leading to the agonizing condition known as the king's disease. Gout was the physical manifestation of the feast. It turned the simple act of walking into a penance. The rulers of the age, who claimed their authority through physical prowess and the ability to lead armies from the front, were often reduced to whimpering figures carried on litters, their joints swollen, red and hot to the touch. Medieval illustrators often depicted gout as a small demon or a black dog biting the toe of the sufferer, a vivid representation of the relentless, throbbing pain. It was a cruel irony that the very foods which proved their status were the agents of their immobilization. The more venison a king consumed to prove his dominance over the forest, the less he was able to stand upon the earth he claimed to own. This biological decay was exacerbated by a profound misunderstanding of nutrition. In the hierarchy of medieval food, the most refined products were those furthest from the ground. The peasantry ate coarse, dark bread filled with bran, husks, and fiber, along with lentils and root vegetables pulled directly from the soil. The nobility, seeking to distance themselves from the dirt and the labor associated with it, demanded white bread, sifted and bolted until almost all nutritional value was gone. They viewed vegetables with deep suspicion, believing they were cold and damp, fit only for those who labored in the mud. By removing the fiber that keeps the human gut functional, the elite effectively shut down their internal clockwork. Their diet was a dense, sluggish stream of purines and proteins. They feasted on the livers of calves, the brains of pigs, the hearts of bullocks, and the sweetbreads of lambs, the most nutrient-dense parts of the animal, but also the most taxing on the liver and gallbladder. Without the sweeping action of dietary fiber to move these heavy substances through the system, these rich meats sat in the gut, fermenting and causing chronic inflammation. The resulting constipation and bowel distress were not just minor inconveniences, they were the constant, silent companions of the crown. A king's life was often a cycle of magnificent public displays of eating, followed by private, agonizing bouts of illness that no amount of prayer or bloodletting could fully resolve. To wash down these heavy burdens, there was the constant flow of alcohol. Water was rarely trusted, and for the nobility it was considered a drink for the impoverished and the holy. Instead, they drank gallons of heavy ale and wine, often sweetened with honey or spiced with expensive imports like ginger and long pepper. This constant state of mild dehydration and sugar loading further taxed the kidneys and inflamed the heart. We see the results in the skeletal remains of the medieval upper class. Stature that should have been robust was often undermined by signs of scurvy, despite their wealth, because they considered fresh fruit and green vegetables to be peasant fodder, unworthy of a royal palate. The body of the ruler became a microcosm of his kingdom's excesses. While the peasant's body was broken by labor and scarcity, the king's body was shattered by the sheer gravity of his own consumption. Their skin grew pale and waxy, their teeth rotted from the honey-soaked delicacies of the court, and their hearts labored under the strain of pumping blood through veins thickened by animal fats. The death of Henry I from a bowl of lampreys was not a freak accident. It was the logical conclusion of a culture that viewed the mastery of appetite as a weakness and the total indulgence of it as the ultimate expression of power. The mouth had indeed become a graveyard, and as the king lay dying in the Norman woods, the very wealth he had consumed finally finished the work of the grave from the inside out. As the heavy silence of the grave settled over the monarch's final feast, the fever of the medieval kitchen began to break. The world was growing larger, and the old definitions of power were dissolving with the dawn of a new era. For centuries, a lord's greatness had been measured by the sheer heat of his plate, by how many pounds of ginger, cinnamon, and precious black pepper could be shoveled into a single sauce. Spices were the gold of the table, a way for the elite to taste the very edge of the map. But the mystery of the East was about to be solved by the cold logic of the compass and the sturdy oak of the merchant keel. As ships carved deep, reliable grooves into the Atlantic and Indian Oceans, the exotic began to suffer the ultimate indignity. It became affordable. When a common merchant's clerk could season his morning pottage with the same cloves and nutmeg that once graced a royal coronation banquet, the nobility realized their status was leaking away.
To remain elite, the menu had to change. They abandoned the burning sands of the spice routes and looked toward the green pastures of their own lands. The heavy, dry perfumes of the past were washed away by a rising tide of animal fat. The kitchen transformed into a quiet laboratory of texture. Butter, which for generations had been the humble grease of the northern peasant, was suddenly elevated to a liquid gold. Cream became the primary vehicle for flavor, replacing the sharp, medicinal bite of galangal and grains of paradise. This was the birth of the sauce as we know it, no longer a pungent mask used to hide the scent of aging meat, but a velvet shroud designed to enhance its luxury. The power of the menu moved from the spice chest to the dairy, signaling a shift from the conquest of distance to the mastery of the local landscape. But it wasn't just the flavors that were evolving. It was the very way a human being interacted with the kill. In 1533, a young Catherine de' Medici arrived at the French court, bringing with her a collection of silver tools that would dismantle the ancient habits of the hall. Before her arrival, even the highest nobles still gripped their meat with greasy palms, using thick slabs of stale bread as sponges and daggers as their only utensils. Catherine introduced the fork. At first, the court mocked it as an effeminate curiosity, a strange barrier placed between the hunter and his hunger. Yet the fork demanded a new kind of distance. It separated the diner from the visceral reality of the beast. You could no longer feel the warmth of the muscle or the slickness of the fat on your skin. Eating was no longer an act of raw physical dominance. It was becoming a performance of choreographed restraint. The monster-heavy menus of the Dark Ages, where peacocks were sewn back into their feathers and boars' heads were served as terrifying trophies of the hunt, began to look like the relics of a barbaric childhood. The Renaissance mind craved order, lightness, and precision. The focus shifted from the terrifying scale of the creature to the sophisticated quality of the technique. The kitchen was no longer a place of raw fire and blackened iron. It was becoming a studio of the senses. As the pungent smoke of the medieval hearth finally cleared, it left behind a world where the fork held the meat and the cream softened the blow, marking the moment when the king stopped being a predator and started being a connoisseur.
The transition from predator to connoisseur was more than a change in etiquette. It was a shift in the very soul of the feast. When the jagged edges of the Dark Ages began to smooth into the rituals of the Renaissance, the dining table stopped being a battlefield and became a stage. Yet, looking back through the smoke of those ancient kitchens, we see that these bizarre banquets were never merely about the satiation of hunger. They were a living cosmology, a way for the powerful to digest the world they sought to rule. To swallow the heart of a stag or the tongue of a lark was to internalize the virtues of the wild, to claim a seat at the center of a hierarchy that stretched from the dirt beneath the boots to the gold of the heavens. Hierarchy was the invisible ingredient in every dish. The closer a creature lived to the sky, the more noble it was deemed for the royal palate. This was not nutrition, it was theology. Every swan carved and every heron served was a physical manifestation of a social order that felt as permanent as the mountains. Fear, too, sat at the table.
To eat the monsters of the forest and the beasts of the sea was to conquer the terrors that lurked just beyond the castle walls. By placing the unknown on a silver platter, the king proved that there was no shadow his light could not reach. We live now in an era of unprecedented excess, but our abundance is sterile. We have traded the symbolic weight of the feast for the convenience of the plastic package and the rapid logistics of the supermarket aisle. Our food is stripped of its story, its origin, and its inherent threat. We eat in a world where the mystery has been boiled away, replaced by the relentless, quiet efficiency of the machine. The medieval king would likely look at our laden tables and find them hollow, lacking the ritualized danger that once made a meal feel like a spiritual act of creation rather than just a biological necessity. As the candles flicker out on this history, one image remains burned into the mind's eye. It is the peacock, reassembled in its iridescent feathers, a torch hidden in its beak to breathe fire across the banquet hall. It was a creature of impossible artifice, a bird that should not speak, but did, in tongues of flame. It serves as a final reminder that for a few centuries, the act of dining was a bridge between the mundane and the monstrous, where a king could look into the eyes of a beast and, for a brief, flickering moment, truly own the earth.